everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is a great turnout. We're very excited to have Gitcoin with us tonight. And thank you to Distributed Global for hosting us once again. We love this space, always a great time here. So welcome to our monthly Rabbithole Talk for the month of March. We've had, in the past, speakers from LivePure, Connext, the Ethereum Foundation, and we're looking forward to a bunch of great talks over the next few weeks and months with Pegasus, Geo, Urbit, and a bunch of other really awesome projects. So please make sure that you're following the CoinFund Twitter account at CoinFund_IO to make sure that you put those on your calendar and you're able to attend and chat with us and these great teams. But today, the project of the hour is Gitcoin. It's a platform that gives open source software developers the opportunity to build, collaborate, and thrive in the emerging blockchain ecosystem. Today, only 0.01% of open source developers are responsible for maintaining open source code. That's a problem, and these guys are working on solving it. On Gitcoin today, you can respond to bounties, participate with CoinFund, which puts ethical advertising into GitHub repos, give grants to provide sustainable funding for open source development, give kudos to great open source devs that you know. And it's awesome. You guys should all check it out and potentially even contribute some cash or some development work after tonight. There's been almost $1 million transacted across the platform, and they've helped connect almost 400 funders reach 20,000 developers, which is amazing. Kevin is the founder of Gitcoin. He has a BS in computer science, 10 years of engineering leadership experience in startups and open source software, and is a community organizer in the Boulder, Colorado tech scene. So yeah, please make sure to follow CoinFund on Twitter, Gitcoin on Twitter, and yeah, hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much to Distributed Global for having me, and also to CoinFund for having me. So the subject of our presentation tonight is open source sustainability in the blockchain era. And by way of introduction, I am Kevin Owocki, founder of Gitcoin. I would not be here if it weren't for Consensus, which is the primary financial backer of Gitcoin. And Joe Lubin was the first believer in Gitcoin, and I owe him a debt of gratitude for that. I am also a meetup organizer in the Colorado blockchain space, Shill, Colorado. We have beautiful sunshine, mountain biking, skiing, IPAs, and it's a really great place to go I lived in New York for 5 years, and when I grew out of my 20-something partying stage and was ready to have a family, Colorado took me in. So I am here to talk about open source software. Gitcoin's mission is to grow and sustain open source software. I've been in the tech scene for the last 12 years, and every project that I've worked on has been based off of open source servers, open source programming languages, open source software, and it's always just been really curious to me that it produces so much value for the world and people aren't able to capture that value. When I talk about open source software, I'm talking about the rule set that there's a release of the source code, there's royalty-free redistribution of the program, and that modifications retain the original software license. This is the original rule set that was introduced by the creators of the open source movement back in the 90s and has allowed open source to compete in a competitive way with the rest of software. So who cares about open source software? Why do I care about open source software? Why do I think that all of y'all should care about open source software? Why do I think the world should care about open source software? Well, first off, almost all applications in the world rely on open source software. The vast majority build on the shoulders of giants, people who have done open source in the past. And all of these brands that you're familiar with and you interact with day over day use open source software. This is a breakdown of percent of open source code that's in a code base. Is this fuzzy for you guys out here? No, it's just fuzzy for me. Okay, so it varies by industry, but the TLDR is that on average 57% of any project in the world is open source code. So This is the foundation that the modern software infrastructure is built upon. To quantify it, almost $400 billion of economic value created by open source software. This is equal to, I think I saw the stat was, it would take 2 million developer years to create this much value if you just started from scratch. For the blockchain people in the house, this is 3.5 billion ETH, which is 27x the market cap of the Ethereum space. So just to I think that I think of blockchains as so massive, and just to think that the wider open source ecosystem is even bigger is kind of humbling to me. So who cares about open source software and open source sustainability? Well, software developers do, data scientists do, 21st century digital creatives do, and if you're not one of those people and you want to build a digital product, then the people that you need to help build that amazing digital product are going to care about open source software. So you should care, because they're really hard to recruit. And if you can build a culture that is built around open source and open source sustainability, then you're going to do a better job recruiting them. I think that what's really, really cool about open source is that it's all available online for free. It's really incredible to me that this rich digital commons exists, and it didn't have to be this way. I mean, I'm 35 now, and it's really, really neat to be at the consensus offices in Bogart and to be hanging out with a bunch of 24-year-olds that were in diapers back when Linux was battling Microsoft for cloud dominance, and it just wasn't a foretold conclusion that open source was going to be such a phenomenon. And I just think it's incredible that we have this rich commons. So in order to talk about open source sustainability, I first want to provide a baseline of why people contribute to open source and what motivates us to contribute to open source software. So I think that there's a set of intrinsic motivations that that people contribute to open source software for. You may do it because it's a personal hobby of yours, and perhaps it scratches an itch of yours, an intellectual itch to contribute to an open source software repository. I think there's sort of like a fun cultural aspect to submitting something to GitHub and having someone across the world who maybe speaks a different language, has a different skin color or gender, and has the exact same problem as you. And then there's just an altruistic wanting to do good for the world. And then there's the extrinsic reasons why you contribute to open source software. So these are the things that, like peer recognition that you get out of making something that's really cool. It may yield speaking opportunities to contribute to open source software. Career advancement. There are companies that will hire you because your open source profile is your digital resume, and they can inspect the code without ever having to interact with you. And then there's financial rewards, which is obviously sort of the space of things that I'm going to be talking about a little bit tonight, because we're talking about open source financial sustainability. So I think that one of the biggest signals that I have that there's a problem with open source financial sustainability is that black swan events keep happening to the modern web, and they affect us all because we all rely on this digital infrastructure. The most famous one is, I think one of the most famous ones in the last 10 years is the Heartbleed bug that happened in 2013. And I can place where it was because I was working at a startup that relied on OpenSSL, and we found out because of an email from our CTO that there was an exploit and a hacker could just dump the memory of the SSL server to the open internet, which for those of you who are not technical is a bad thing. It means that passwords could be exposed to the open internet if they're stored in memory, and we all had to patch our server. And so if you look under the covers and you do an autopsy of what went wrong there, turns out the OpenSSL Foundation, which produces OpenSSL, has less than $1 million per year in funding, and a couple of developers that work on OpenSSL, I think, are either, there's a couple that are full-time and a few that are part-time. And then the other one that I want to talk about tonight is that this happened only 6 months ago, but a hacker infected a Node.js package that had a distribution in the thousands or tens of thousands to steal Bitcoin from Bitcoin wallets. And basically, so if you did an NPM update, or I guess I'm a pip guy, so I don't know what the equivalent is in NPM, but if you updated this package, then you would get pulled down malware, and then wherever you distributed your software, it would have some sort of malware that would steal your Bitcoin private keys and therefore your Bitcoin. And the reason why the hacker got a hold of the Node.js package was because the maintainer just built the Node.js package for fun, never got any money out of it, just got some peer recognition, and he got tired of contributing to it. And so when the hacker asked nicely if he could help maintain it, he was like, yeah, sure. And because of that, a lot of people lost Bitcoin. So I think of the open source maintainer lifecycle as follows. If you're someone who's released a package out to the world that you think does something really great, there's just this euphoria that happens when you release that package out to the world. You'll get a digital high five from someone. They'll say, this is cool, thank you so much for your work. But as time goes on, the novelty wears off, more people start to rely on your software. You'll start to get more comments that take your good deed and take it for granted. So basically the comments become, this is cool, but can you make it do X? Or this is cool, can you transpile it to my desktop Linux software that you're not using? And then the worst form of this is, why haven't you fixed this yet? The entitlement that can come along with, this issue has been opened for 9 months. I can't believe that this is happening. You're so incompetent. Please never make an open source package again. And it's these kind of interactions that ruin the happy path of contributing to open source software, that make open source maintainers want to quit. So I think that it's incumbent upon us as technology people who are designing our 21st century infrastructure, and maybe if blockchain becomes the thing, the incentive structures that will power the 21st century digital economy, to think about this as a design challenge and to solve it. Put another way, 65% of open source projects have a truck factor of less than or equal to 2. So that $400 billion per value that I told you about earlier in the presentation, most of the 65% of those software repositories have 2 or less maintainers. So truck factor just means the number of people who would need to get hit by a truck for the project to go away. And it's sort of a dark metric, but it's a good way of telling you that basically these people are the choke points that are maintaining our 21st century digital infrastructure, and they're where we should focus if we want to solve the problem. So as a summary, life as a maintainer can be great because there's a lot of learning, you create a lot of value, both in your personal network and your skill set, but there's a suck of time and burnout, and something that I want to change, or at least offset as part of our mission at Gitcoin, which is the subject of this talk. How do I fund all my projects? It's probably the most unfortunate word that I've put on a set of slides. And I give this talk at ETH Denver, and this is the slide that someone, like Joe Lubin tweeted this slide out. And I was like, I couldn't have picked another slide to tweet out. So if you're going to tweet about this talk, don't tweet about this slide. So what has been tried before? We've tried asking the massive cloud hosting platforms nicely to pay for their massive use of open source software. If there's anyone that's from Amazon in the house, I'm looking at you. AWS has had a massive impact on the ability for startups to bring a project to market, and so have other cloud hosting platforms. But a lot of their managed services are just wrappers around open source software, and the maintainers don't see a dime for the amount of installs that are being created. And there are people in the world who think that that's a problem, and that if your project, there should basically, for the value created in the world, the value capture should be given back to the maintainer, and that could be massively profitable if it happened, because production is single-threaded, but consumption is multi-threaded and sometimes exponential, and so there could be massive upside if maintainers could capture the value that's being created by their software. All of these things have been tried before. You can't see it because we messed up the framing of this presentation, but there's a link down here to Lemonade Stand, which is a GitHub repo by Nadia Eghbal, basically cataloging all of the different ways that you can make money as an open source software maintainer. I'm not going to read them all to you, but there's a little bit over a dozen, about 16 different ways that you as a software maintainer can make money for your contributions in open source. The ones that are the most common are being self-funded or no funding, which I think is super depressing. Finding an employer who's benevolent enough to let you work on open source as maybe 20% of your day job or as your full day job. Consulting and services is number 3, which I mean, depending on what you're consulting and what you're doing services on, probably means that you're not doing a lot of coding. It probably means you're doing a lot of selling, marketing yourself, going to client visits, stuff like that. So I think that we can do better, and this is the set of criteria that Gitcoin has for how we can do better. So basically, we want to create products that compensate well, that have an impact, and for us that means that has a positive impact on the world. Probably means that that you spend a high amount of time coding what you're actually producing as software product, and you're creating impact in the world through that, not through writing a book or speaking at conferences or doing consulting, and that it aligns with your values. So if you're getting employed by an employer to work on open source software, I think that that's in most cases a very benevolent thing, but you run the risk of capture of what you're doing by the needs of that employer and the roadmap being captured by the person who's paying the bills of the maintainers. So it's at this point of the presentation where most of the audience says to me, Kevin, I agree with everything that you're saying, but you've been singing this song and people have been singing this song for 20 years. And I just don't have any hope that this is going to change. And I think that that's pretty fair. I mean, this is like a 20-year-old problem. That wasn't supposed to be a joke, but I just want to I think that there's a blockchain straw man that could be played that is like, oh, all of a sudden everything's going to change because of blockchain. And I think that I think that if you don't pay respect for how long of a struggle this has been for people for a long time, then you risk sort of like falling into that trap. But I do think that the design space of blockchain and open source, for me, is the most promising thing in a generation for solving this problem. And the reason for that is I think that we value open source maintenance, and with programmable money, we can program our values into our money. And I think that if those two things are true, then it follows to me that we can program our money such that it can be profitable to maintain open source software. And that sort of gives me a lot of hope that from first principles that we're going to solve this problem with blockchain. Another reason why I think that we're going to be able to solve this problem with blockchain is that I make the analogy of blockchain being like the early internet. So the internet changed the way the world works because it was the ability for a computer network to transfer information without an intermediary. And it changed our politics, it changed our media, it changed the way we do entertainment. And I think of blockchain as being the exact same thing, but for money instead of information. So now we can transfer money across the network without an intermediary. And so what's that going to change? Maybe everything that relies on financial services, and that's just that's a huge potential change. And so I think about how before the internet, you wouldn't send an email to your coworker, or you wouldn't send a snail mail to your coworker asking if they wanted to get lunch, because it wouldn't make any sense. It's too expensive and it takes too long. But you would send an email, or you would send an IM to ask that question. And so we send 1,000x more information because of the internet than we did before. And that's opened up completely new use cases. I mean, IM and email are not even the innovative ones. We've got Twitter now, and that's changed our world completely. And so what's the 1,000x use case of financial services that the blockchain can bring as a breakthrough? And then the third one is just like the pure financial, the pure financial reason why it's going to be different. So there's, depending on when I'm giving this presentation, $100 billion to $900 billion in crypto market cap, and all of the money that everyone needs developers, and everything is increasingly built on open source and remote rails. And so you've got this commons of software development that you can get funded. And if we're building an open source financial system, then all of the money that used to go to some back office on Wall Street is now going to go to open source, which is just, oh wow, there might be funding for open source in the future. And so that's why I have hope in the design space of blockchain meets open source. And the dream is that Gitcoin is the Swiss Army knife that creates tools within this design space that solve these problems. The way I think about it, I am a software engineer, and I think about this like a funnel. So basically, if you take a sample of 100,000 people, probably only 0.001% of them have ever contributed to open source software, and probably 1 out of 10 of them are doing the maintainer's job, which is, I should have defined earlier, but is just the situational awareness, roadmap planning, the kind of things that you can't capture in a task that's bountyable is the maintainer's job. And so Gitcoin basically wants to build a suite of products that take users of open source software and convert them. We create a crypto economic force that converts them from user to contributor of open source software, and then from contributor to maintainer of open source software. It's just a funnel problem, that's all it is. And the more value that we can accrue at the maintainer level, the more we can create redundancy, and the more we can decrease the amount of projects that have a chart factor problem. And so the other way I guess you could look at the construction of Gitcoin is that we're a double-sided market that connects coders to funders. So basically the product that we're most famous for is bounties. You can take any GitHub issue and you can put it into Gitcoin and attach an Ether or Ethereum token bounty to that issue, and we'll source from our network of 20,000 software developers someone who will work on it. They'll work on it, and then they'll get paid the money, and you'll get code without ever having to learn what that Python package that was screwed up in your in your code base was going wrong. And so we've learned that not only building the mechanics of connecting these two has been valuable, but having the fresh POW on both sides is really valuable. I'm from Colorado, so I have to drop at least one skiing reference on you. The fresh POW on both sides of the market adds a lot of value to the network, and people don't just want to have a place to host their bounties, they want you to find the coders for them, and that's sort of the value add that Gitcoin has. So these are our stats so far. We're going to cross $1 million probably this week. Done bounties with Aragon, MetaMask, Consensus, Polymath, Decentraland. Some of the top projects in the space are using Gitcoin to deploy capital to developers. The Ethereum Foundation themselves is using us. Super proud of this visualization of the mesh network of human beings inside of Gitcoin that we coded up. Basically, the nodes in this network are people or projects, and then the edges are financial transactions that we've created between them. And so we're creating a peer-to-peer jobs network. All right, so I want to go down the home stretch of my presentation by talking about 5 options within the intersection of blockchain and open source that I'm very excited about, and I think could possibly be a sea change in open source sustainability. And by doing that, I want to first tell you about the status quo that is not going to work, and that's benevolent billionaires or corporations that are funding open source software. And shout out to Joe Lubin, who's the benevolent billionaire that's gotten Gitcoin off the ground. I think that Joe, to his credit, has dropped millions of dollars into the investment in the Ethereum ecosystem, and Ethereum would not be the #1 blockchain smart contract platform if it were not for Joe. And there are dozens of other companies that are championing dozens of other causes with their capital. But there's a problem here, and that's that there's not enough funding for not enough causes, and there's also a problem with capture. And so I don't think that this is a sustainable model, and I put together a little slideshow to drive that point home. If you see any of these people walking down the street, ask them to fund your open source project, and then you'll believe in me. Boy, what a transition. All right, so Moloch DAO is a DAO, which means Distributed Autonomous Organization, that was put together by Amin Soleimani. It's named after, I guess he made up a god named Moloch that's supposed to be the god of solving coordination problems, and we believe that the funding for open source software is just an example of tragedy of the commons, or the classic age-old problem of the categorical imperative. And so basically what he's done is put together a DAO that takes donations, and there's a council of people who have donated to the DAO, and they get to vote on proposals for funding for open source software in the Ethereum space. And the sort of like governance mechanism is if you feel like the DAO has been captured and you don't agree with what they're doing anymore, you can do this thing called rage quit, which basically allows you to get your money back before a proposal. There's a 7-day period where if a proposal that you don't like is going to get funded, you can rage quit and you can get your money back before that proposal has been funded. And so that's his like minimum viable way of solving the problem of open source sustainability. But I think it's sort of limited by the fact that it's based off of donations, which we've tried before, and that we're only talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we need to scale up to millions, probably billions, in order to solve this problem for real. The second one that I'm really excited about is microdonations, and this is a tweet from Vitalik from only 2 or 3 weeks ago, basically proposing a community norm, so also donations, that clients or wallets can charge 1 GWay per transaction for their wallet, and it goes to wallets or node maintainers. And basically the idea here is that we just build micro donations into wallets, and it's 1,000x use of blockchain. So basically, if I was to give a penny to you, it wouldn't be all that significant. But if hundreds of thousands of people were sending pennies, then maybe it would be a significant thing for the funding of many of these projects. And so it could be 1,000x use case of blockchain. I think that it's somewhat limited, although it can raise millions of dollars. It's only going to affect wallets and clients, and arguably there's a time preference problem there. The Pegasus team at Consensus is spending millions of dollars building an ETH 2.0 client, and ETH 2.0 might not go live for another year or 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 10. But so there's a time preference problem with doing that. Inflation funding is an EIP that I proposed along with several others in the community in the Ethereum space a few weeks ago. And basically the idea is that right now there's a 2 ETH block reward every 14 seconds that goes to miners in the Ethereum space. And the miners are rewarded for doing work that secures the blockchain and secures all the transactions on it. And so we proposed a 10% increase in block rewards that would not go to the miners, that would go to a DAO or an organization that administers grants to software developers who are working on ETH 2.0, who are working on ETH 1x. And maybe if we extended it far enough that are doing other good things in the ecosystem, And the idea is to provide $100 million per year in funding in a bear market, $100 million per year, which means 1,000 developers per year who are just working on the commons, who are just working on open source software, if we can scale this up. And I think that's really exciting because it will create a pool of people who can work in the Ethereum space and just work for the public good and will not go into competing blockchains and will not launch another ICO. Problem is governance. Obviously, there's a problem with capture where if you just keep on injecting capital into a system, then people will try to become the oligarchs that sit on that capital and monopolize it, and that's not a good thing. Fourth one that I'm excited about, and I think we're in the home stretch here, is CodeFund, which is a Gitcoin product that provides recurring passive revenue from non-tracking contextual ads. So basically the idea here is that if you're a developer of an open source software project, you can put an ad on any website that you own. Typically open source maintainers will have a web presence that has 10,000 stars or 1,000 forks and have no way to monetize it without selling out their audience. And CodeFund provides ethical ads as a way of solving that problem. And so we just basically connect publishers to people who, to developers using ethical ads, and doing about $15,000 monthly right now. The fifth and final one that I want to tell you about is Gitcoin Grants, which is a decentralized Patreon, which provides recurring revenue for open source projects. We're using EIP 1337, which is the lead standard for recurring transactions on Ethereum. So basically, the insight here is that subscriptions power the fiat economy, and subscriptions are a really great way to build a business. We wanted to bring subscriptions to the blockchain space. And so you sign once and the money is debited from your account every month. The first use case that we've done on this open standard is Gitcoin Grants, which has raised about a little bit over 100K so far, and doesn't have governance issues because it's just people contributing peer-to-peer to their favorite open source projects. We provided an extra boost to Gitcoin Grants when we paired it with something called Constrained Capital Liberal Radicalism, which is a paper by Glenn Weil and Vitalik Buterin. Has anyone in the audience heard of Glenn Weil? A few people. I saw at Radical Exchange this weekend. And basically the way CLR works is it's just a way of funding community contribution or projects that the community cares about. So if you've got a project that you raise $275 from one contributor, then you'll get a $275 match for that project. Whereas if you raise $275 from 10 contributors, you'll have almost a $3,000 match. So it weights heavily projects that are widely supported as opposed to just projects that are supported by the whales, which is apparently, according to Glenn Weil, the mathematically optimal way to fund projects that people actually care about. So read Radical Markets by Glenn Weil if you haven't. Some ideas that Vitalik and many others in the blockchain space are excited about. This is round one that we did in February of 2019. You'll see that Prismatic Labs raised $1,600 and got $6,500 in CLR matching. I would ask the audience to draw their attention to number 5 and 6. Lodestar, which is an ETH 2.0 client, raised $2,600 in CLR matching from 10 contributions, and Lighthouse had slightly less contributions and raised $2,200, even though they raised more in their initial contributions than Lodestar did. They didn't get as much matching because they didn't get as broad of a base of support. So this is one of Glenn's ideas that we've been experimenting with on Gitcoin Grants, and there's still time to get your contributions matched for ETH 2.0 and ETH 1X. We could reduce the time to market and reduce the odds of a black swan event happening for these projects if we make sure that they're fully funded, and you can do that on gitcoin.co/grants. So those are the examples of what I'm excited about. I want to leave you with a final thought, and that's that we are making history as a community right now building an open source financial ecosystem, but there's actually a rich history of the fight for the open internet that's been happening since the 80s, since the start of the Free Software Foundation, and in the 90s, the battles over the way software was going to be created and monetized between Oracle, Microsoft, Linux, Google, and others. And through the late 90s into the 2000s, with the Linux Foundation being founded, with Red Hat being founded, with Linux emerging to compete for mind share and install share, I think that this is just such a beautiful chart. There's a reason why Gitcoin's logo is a tree that's branching off in all directions, and it's incredible to me that for 20 years a project like Linux has been branching and dying and succeeding in a bunch of different ways. This is evolution right here. And I think that it's not appreciated enough that the launch of the Bitcoin white paper and the Ethereum white paper in the 2010s is the next step in this cultural heritage of building an open source world. The internet touches everything because information touches everything, but financial value touches everything because we as a human civilization have a coordination problem about what we value and what we want to fund. And Bitcoin was really the beginning of a punctuated equilibrium that could mean that there's an open source financial ecosystem. So the thought that I would leave you with is that you are here, and in 10 or 20 years, when the history of this space is written, please do something meaningful, please do something that solves a historic problem. For me, I think that the world would be much better if open source was sustainable, not just sustainable, but profitable. Thank you very much for having me. I don't know how we're doing on time. Is there time for questions? Or?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely time for questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let's say you're a developer and you have a great idea and you feel it's going to help millions of people. Obviously you make it open source, but how can you capture value? Usually these big companies like Red Hat, or they'll wrap around their proprietary GUIs around open source software. Is that still a viable model? But can people do it in a way where they could share some of that value back with users and not just become, conglomerates that monopolize the industry?
Yeah, I hope so. I think that so there's been ways to do this in the past. You wrap your open source package in a SaaS model and you deploy it to the world, and you just make monthly subscriptions off of it, and that's one way to do it. There's also there's a couple of ways to skin that cat. I think that one of the big hopes that people have with the blockchain space is that, well, maybe there'll be protocol level rewards. If it is a public good, then there could be protocol level rewards, and you can make a case that that your project solves a core problem and pursue those protocol level rewards. I also think that sort of the promise, and it's kind of passé now to even say this, but in 2017, everyone thought they were going to launch a utility token and build a utility token model into their project, and that users would capture value and be a part owner of the network because they owned the token. And I think that we were sort of kidding ourselves a little bit when we did that, but there is promise in that model. My first job out of school was at Vanguard, which is the mutual fund company in southeastern Pennsylvania. And they have this really interesting model where if you buy a Vanguard fund, you're buying a share in Vanguard. And that seems like a small thing, but if you're a manager at Vanguard, that means that you don't have to choose between doing what's right for the fund holders and doing what's right for the people who own Vanguard, because they're the same actor, because your fund owners are the people who own Vanguard. And so I think that that's a powerful model, and I would really like to see, I don't get like political other than the inflation funding stuff. which will get quite political as we try to get it into the Istanbul hard fork in the fall. But I would really like to see some sort of change in the way securities are done in the United States to allow people to do crowdfunding from non-accredited investors in the U.S. in a non-predatory way, because I think that would allow you, if you're launching that product, to sell shares to people all across the internet who might not be rich and accredited, but could still see the value in your project and might want to be a part owner of it. Good question. I think I saw one back there.
Yeah, how do we make the bounty model work for maintainers and not just contributors? In particular with the young sort of open source projects?
I'm going to be off-brand AF right now, but I don't think it can. I think that bounties are really good for accelerating the contributor part of the funnel, but I don't think that they do a really good job of accelerating things for maintainers, because maintainers are typically doing work that is very requires a lot of situational awareness. So what is the roadmap? What is the history? What has worked in the past? What hasn't? What's the brand name of this project? And you can't encapsulate all of that stuff into a bounty unless you write it all into the documentation. And most of the time people don't read your documentation. So I unfortunately don't think you can. Actually, the reason why we launched CoinFund is that these maintainers typically have a large web audience, but they have no way to monetize it. And so just providing passive income with ads, we've found that we've been able to provide more value to maintainers that way. And sometimes if they want to scale up their workforce, they can do it with bounties, but the model of a user putting a bounty for a maintainer to turn something around has not worked for us thus far. More questions? Go ahead.
So I know that certain more prolific open source maintainers have experimented a little bit with raising funds as an individual as opposed to per project, either via Patreon or some other platform. I'm just kind of curious what do you think about that model, whether you think it's interesting and a good compliment, or whether it doesn't have any.
I think that it's interesting and that it shows promise. There's a lot of different models that in my mind just sort of fall under the donation model, and for me that sort of falls in the donation model unless the investor is looking to get a return. And it feels like we've tried 100,000 different configurations of donations, and they might give you a couple of months or a couple of years of runway if you know some whales, but it just seems like there's kind of a ceiling there to me. I'd be happy to be presented with evidence that shows me I was wrong, though, because then that would be maybe a thread that we could follow up. So do you have any stats, or do you know any times that's really worked really well?
I don't have any stats. I just know that certain members from the Bitcoin core community I know Ruby Dash Jr. has set up a big account for them. I don't actually know what the performance of that has been, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's so funny to me that you would use Patreon in the Bitcoin space. Kind of feels like using snail mail to send someone for, I don't know. But yeah, I'll check that out. That's cool. Thank you.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on the Zcash protocol.
I think that they're super smart. Actually, I was at Radical Exchange this weekend, and I walked up to the mic when Zuko was speaking, and I was like, hey, say hypothetically someone was going to propose inflation funding for blockchain on another blockchain, and would you have any advice for that person? And he was like, oh, hey Kevin, I saw your EIP. And what he told me was that they just put it in the beginning, and there was no debate about it. And all the internet commenters that feel like they're gracing us with their opinions all the time, they just didn't matter because they bundled it in from the beginning. And so he didn't have a ton of advice for us about how to get it in after the fact. But to answer your question directly, I think that it was really smart of them to put it in the beginning. They don't have a public goods problem in the Zcash space. Now they have a governance problem. They have a huge where do we deploy this funds problem, and how do we make sure it's safe and transparent and decentralized and accountable problem, but that's a solvable problem. And so I think that the Ethereum space probably has a lot to learn from them if this EIP goes through. More questions?
Just curious if there's a new product out there called Open Source Coin. I was just curious if you had any thoughts about their approach.
Yeah, we're friends with Ellie and Alexis. They're, how do I say this nicely? For a little while when I was starting Gitcoin, I would go to hackathons and I would like trip over people who were trying to build open source rewards with blockchain because it's just such an obvious idea. And a lot of those projects didn't make it just because the founders didn't stick with it, or it was just a fun project for them. But Elliot and Alexis are legit, and they really care deeply about open source. And luckily, they're taking a complementary approach to what Gitcoin's doing. And I think OS rank is a really novel use of figuring out what has value in open source. OS rank is basically like, you know how PageRank uses links on the web to create a metadata exhaust that tells you what's valuable on the web? PageRank? They're doing the same thing for open source. So basically, if you contribute to open source and a lot of people reference your commit in comments or in whatever, then they assume that that's a highly ranked contribution or a highly ranked project. And so they're building an OS rank for what is valuable in open source. And then they're going to have this blockchain that has inflation funding that distributes rewards to the highly weighted projects. And I think it's, depending on what their token launches price is at, they could be distributing $3 million to the top NPM modules, which is just, talk about a user onboarding tool. So I guess this is a long way of saying that I think OS Coin has a lot of promise, and hopefully over the next 6 months you'll see an announcement about us collaborating with them. Does anyone who's not a white dude have a question? Okay. You.
White dude question.
Yeah.
This is also maybe a spot for Sam, but how does this inflation funding and the EIP differ from live peer?
Sounds like a question for Sam. So inflation funding in this scenario would be inflation funding on the Ethereum blockchain, which would be given to a DAO whose charter is to fund ETH 2.0 and ETH 1.x projects, reduce black swans, reduce time to market for Ethereum. I think live peer,
But you're trying to negotiate with miners, which is just like fictional negotiation, right?
we are in touch with some miners, and I think that it really depends on your time preference for. So if you're a miner, it depends on your time preference. If your time preference is super short and you're selling your ether really fast, then you don't want to see this pass because it inflates the token supply in a way that doesn't go into your pocket. But if your time preference is long and you believe that software developers are going to increase the value of your holdings long term because you're building a smart contract layer that's going to be built for developers by developers, then in theory, if your time preference is long, then you see higher returns. So that's the first argument. But I guess the second argument is we're all moving to proof of stake whenever ETH 2.0 comes out, and like stakers are fundamentally going to have that longer time preference. And so there's a big question about whether this happens now or it happens after proof of stake. But if it happens after proof of stake, then it sort of shifts us more into the latter camp where the incentives are more aligned. I guess in the third answer to your question is we're going on a listening campaign in the next 2 months to talk to everyone in the ecosystem about this, and hit me up after that. I'll tell you what the miners think. I'll actually have data.
I'm just curious also from a live peer data perspective versus inflation funding.
Yeah, I read Live Peer's white paper a long time ago. I can't answer that question, but if someone from Live Peer wants to get on the mic and tell us about that, they can.
So
LivePeer has, so for people who don't really aren't familiar with how like the community grants work for LivePeer, there is a node inside LivePeer that has a much larger reward cut than most other nodes. So LivePeer is like a staking system, right? And it takes 50% of all the rewards, and it takes that reward and it uses it as a treasury for the grants program, and it funds like projects in the ecosystem with that grant. Now it's not a huge amount, so there's been maybe 10, like less than 20 projects that's been funded in that in the process of 8 months. So that's kind of the stat. It's been pretty successful.
What's the monetary amount?
The monetary amount is it's in tokens, so it really differs depending on the scope of the project. I think it goes anywhere between like a couple $100 to $1,000 up to like $10,000-$20,000. I'm just like making a wild guess here because a lot of times when the grants are given, the token price is different from.
Is it inflation funded, or is it people who's paying for the transcoding that's funding those grants?
It's inflation funded.
Oh,
So
the
inflation goes to the node itself. And the interesting thing here is anybody in the ecosystem can decide that I want to participate in this inflation funding by bonding their token toward the node that takes a larger cut. So what they're saying is I'm sharing a part of the inflation that I'm supposed to get with the community, and in exchange, well, there's no exchange, but I'm just like doing this because I believe in the long-term vision of the protocol. So for example, a lot of the early participants in LivePeer, who like a lot of people who hold more tokens than other people, are doing this as a way to like build the ecosystem, and that's a long-term incentive alignment.
Thank you. Any more questions? Do we have an announcement about what's going on after this? Are we just hanging out for 15 minutes and?
I guess, are there any other questions?
I have like a really broad question.
Okay.
Since I'm not a white guy, I felt compelled to ask. So in your realistic dreams, what would the open source world look like in 5 years? What would be happening?
I would like to see funding for. I'd like to see ETH 2.0 launched. Start there. I think that Ethereum is the project that's taking decentralization and the project that's taking the sum of Ethereum, of decentralization and throughput together the most seriously. And so I'd like to see ETH 2.0 launched so it could be a substrate of the blockchain-based internet. So I think in order to get there, we have to fund people who are working on the commons and not just the projects that have a business model in order to get there. So I'd like to see people incentivized, being paid market rates for senior software engineers, being able to support their family and their kids and their golden retrievers by working for the blockchain. And then I'd also like to see on top of that, I'd like to see kind of like a Google Summer of Code style thing where students can learn about the blockchain and they can work on open source for a summer and get paid whatever the market rate is for them. And in the vision, the long-term vision really is self-sovereign jobs, is being able to work for each other peer-to-peer on the internet, being able to work for projects that are for the good of humanity and for the commons, as opposed to just projects that you can trick a VC into thinking they're going to make a 100x return on. But I guess the TLDR answer to your question is ETH 2.0 needs to get out. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. That was awesome, super interesting.